Resident Evil, Silent Hill, to a lesser degree Countdown Vampires. Survival horror, as far as I was concerned at the time, ruled the PS1 generation. For some reason, I don't think I ever found out, I was drawn to this niche horror genre, which was a bit of a surprise for me. I really didn't care about horror outside of the survival preface, and to be honest, I had never enjoyed a puzzle in my life up to that point. Regardless of the reason, I was hooked, but like you might expect from any other addiction, that becomes a bit of a problem when your supply gets cut off. And there eventually would come a time where I had played every single instance of the genre that a teen could get their hands on, and obviously, I wanted more. Well, enter Fatal Frame, the brainchild of Makoto Shibata, and the answer to the question, what if Resident Evil, but ghosts? It's honestly a series that already sits pretty close to everything I enjoy, but conversely, one that I don't have a lot of experience with. And I'm nothing if not a man willing to retroactively make up for his mistakes. Which means moving forward here on the channel, we're going to be barreling through this franchise with the hopes of digging out some survival horror hidden gems. So load up on film and get ready to go on a bit of a walking tour of abandoned Japanese real estate, because this is the Fatal Frame Retrospective.
So this is Himuro Mansion.
The first entry in what would eventually become a long-running franchise came about thanks to series co-creator Makoto Shibata's run-ins with the paranormal as a kid. And like any other rational adult, he used his childhood traumas to inflict a little bit of trauma on other people. So after finishing up work on Tecmo's Deception, a weird hybrid first-person trap-laying game that for some reason always seems to be labeled as an RPG, Shibata started dreaming up a new game that would use the inherently scary atmosphere of old abandoned Japanese residences to cause a fraction of the terror that he claims to have lived through. By this point, early PS2 dev kits were available to the company, and this seemed like a perfect fit. The team had previously been inspired by the first Silent Hill, specifically the way it took the survival horror format and set it in a game filled with fully 3D polygons and a more dynamic camera system. Shibata, during his time on Deception, had always had old Japanese structures as a dream location in his head, but at the time the limited rendering capabilities of the PS1 was a hurdle a little too high to leap. So now, with the raw power of the PS2 at his fingers, he could finally merge those two realities together, the Silent Hill-inspired survival horror game and the Japanese dilapidated structures being a setting. This being a game about ghosts, the staff, both before and during development, watched a lot of old and new Japanese ghost movies, and believe me, that shines through very clearly while you play. Maybe 75% of the cutscenes that you're going to see play out as slow-paced scenarios that has Miku eyes wide with realization, slowly turning her head to see the ghost sitting just behind her. It's a massive stereotype in the genre, and it is genuinely comical how often it happens in this game. And you know, on that note, I should probably mention here that I'd never really been a Japanese ghost story kind of guy. I'm truly not sure why, but this culture's view on the supernatural always kind of struck me as the furthest thing from scary. While on the other hand, Western depictions of the same stuff always leave me with a little more fright. And I'd love to get into why that is, but like I said, I haven't exactly figured that one out for myself yet. But the good news is that doesn't really matter, because this is a survival horror game, and as I've consistently proven in the past, my love for the genre is able to stand up to even the most stringent downsides. And before we really jump into things, out of this game's 2 official ports, you're going to be seeing mostly footage of the Xbox Special Edition for a number of reasons. But before we get into those, we gotta talk story. Fatal Frame starts out with a monologue from our main character Miku. She talks about how her and her brother were always able to see supernatural stuff around them, which understandably ostracized them to some degree. Since neither of them had anyone to confide in, they developed a really close relationship built on their shared ability to see dead people. Flash forward some amount of time, and Miku's brother Mafuyu heads to a place called Himuro Mansion. His mentor and a few of his assistants went to that same mansion in the hopes of researching the folklore and accounts of strange happenings surrounding the place. But when the author fails to come back, Mafuyu sets out to see what's going on, which are the events we get to play through in the intro sequence. Upon giving the place a once-over and walking around for a few minutes, Mafuyu ends up falling victim to the same supernatural stuff that got his buds, and that's where we come in, because the game actually starts when Miku shows up to look for her brother. As she makes her way through the mansion, Miku comes across an old-timey looking camera, and upon touching it, she gets a vision of what might have happened to her brother. In the process of looking for him, Miku's able to dig up some of her brother's journal entries detailing why his author friend may have been interested in this place. It seems like it has a nasty habit of being a hotbed for murders and whole family massacres, which makes a lot of sense because not long after that, she comes across the mansion's supernatural security system, which is when she finds out the camera obscura that she found has the ability to exorcise ghosts. And that's going to come in real handy since there seems to be more ghosts here in this mansion than air molecules. As the game continues, you're probably going to notice that the vast majority of its story is revealed through these scattered documents and letters that you can find, which is a little unique. I mean, survival horror games having readable journal entries that give up small bits of world building and plot details is definitely nothing new, but you typically don't come across a game that tells most of its story through them. But that's not to say there are no cutscenes in Fatal Frame, because there's actually a pretty good amount of them. But for the most part, they're here to do one of three things: set up a scare, introduce a ghost, or flashback to give a visual reference for information that was previously found in a journal. For example, you're going to come across tons of left-behind documents from Mafuyu's author friend chronicling their eventual demise in text, but in some places you'll get to see a vision detailing exactly how that all went down. Since Miku can see into the other side, every so often you'll get these glimpses of events that aren't going to make much sense to you until you start coming across more and more reading material. And when you do, you'll find out that this mansion is the home of an incredibly brutal ritual. Every generation or so, the people that run this place pick a young girl to sacrifice and tear her limb from limb using ropes. Then they take those ropes, soak them in the woman's blood, and use them as a seal for something called the Hell Gate, a door to the afterlife that, if not restrained, will release something everyone calls the Malice. The last time they attempted this ritual, something went wrong. Normally, the Shrine Maiden is essentially locked away from the outside world. She's supposed to know nothing except for the fact that her sacrifice is the only thing that can keep the Hellgate closed. But instead of having the required no connections to the living world, this generation's Shrine Maiden, Kirie Himuro, meets and falls in love with a guy visiting the mansion. Her dad worries that this is going to interfere with things and orders some of the staff to murder the guy and dump his body somewhere far away. But eventually, Kirie gets a whiff of what went down, and this made her not want to go through with the ritual, which in turn caused it to fail. When Mafuyu showed up, it sort of kicked things into high gear because he's a dead ringer for the man Kirie fell in love with before she was killed. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the Malice is per se, but I do know that after the failed ritual, it got out, killing everyone in the mansion and cursing their spirits to wander its halls forever. Anyone coming to the mansion since then, well, the ones who aren't immediately killed upon entering, will start to manifest these stigmata-like wounds that resemble the ropes used to pull the maiden apart. It's sort of like a progressive disease, and when the last wound shows up, I guess you die or can't leave or something. I can't really remember coming across any journals that weren't vague about it, but either way, these wounds are like a ticking clock. And since they started showing up on our girl Miku, she's now staring down whatever fate they hold. The author who was killed here while trying to research the mansion for his book, Takamine, uncovered a method to shut the Hellgate that requires a piece of mirror to be reassembled, and since we don't want this happening on a global scale, that's what we get busy doing. Once you've gotten a good idea of what the ritual is and who's involved in it, some of the out-of-context flashbacks that you're shown at the start of the game will start making more sense retroactively. And I gotta admit, it was a bit of an aha moment when I connected these events to what I was reading about in the journals, and I think that's the key word here. Like I said before, this is a mostly text-driven story, and I'm not exactly against that. In fact, you could say I'm very much for it, but I do feel like that's not going to draw in the kind of people who aren't already really down with this genre. It's actually kind of close to the sort of experience you can have playing an early Silent Hill game. Like, sure, there's a story you can roughly follow using spoken dialogue and cutscenes alone, but it's when you dig into the readable files that you unlock the rest of the iceberg. Except for in this case, it's a little more mandatory. And I gotta say, there's something kind of intimate and mysterious about delivering a story this way. I can't really tell you why, but it made me feel more invested. And I guess it is a good thing they went in this direction, given the game's voice acting is, not the best.
The rest of you, hurry and escape.
But what about you?
But in the same way every dark cloud has its silver lining, on the plus side our main character might only have like 10 lines of dialogue in the entire game, and a good chunk of them aren't even complete sentences, so you're not going to be reminded of that voice acting all too often. And since we're on the subject of ghosts, maybe some of you might want to disappear while I dive into some spoilers. I'll go ahead and put a timestamp on screen that you can skip to if this is a story that you're interested in seeing for yourself. If I'm being totally honest, I'm not entirely sure anyone cares enough about a more than 20-year-old PS2 horror game to do that, but I guess then again, if people didn't give a shit about old horror games, I'd probably be out of a job, so here we are. Okay, so now that it's just us series vets and those of you who weren't able to get to your phones fast enough to skip this part, Fatal Frame's story really starts to ramp up in the final stretches. Once you make it to that last night, the game finally starts throwing some cutscenes that contain exposition and dialogue at you, but like the rest of the experience, all the really good stuff is found in the journal entries. Speaking of which, if you've been reading those, you will have gotten a lot of messed up details on the stuff done to Kide, the girl in the last ritual. And sure, reading about it is pretty tough, but in this final section, we get to see the area she lived most of her life in. It's basically like a prison cell, and actually getting to see it really puts her struggle into perspective. Throughout the game, we've encountered this apparition of a little girl, but unlike the rest of Himuro Mansion's denizens, this one isn't actively trying to kill you. She mostly only shows up in cutscenes or as a wandering image that you can catch with your camera if you're quick enough, but whenever you encounter her, she's almost always trying to help you out. Well, after we collect a few pieces of a mirror and use them to try and seal off the Hellgate, we find out who it is. After the failed ritual resulted in her corruption, all the good parts of Kidei split off to form this innocent child. Which is nice they gave us an excuse besides little girls in kimonos being a staple in Japanese ghost media and inherently being kinda creepy. And you know what, actually, before we go any further, I've gotta talk about this ending. Now, it's not outwardly ridiculous or anything. In fact, it's pretty standard fare, but it's the subtext that really gets me. Okay, so this entire time we've learned about this terrible ritual where these women need to be tortured and maimed just to keep this Hellgate closed, right? And if you're a normal human being with emotions, you'll probably end up developing a slight anti-this ritual kind of position. And that's good, that's the way you should probably feel. Only when the mirror is put in place and we defeat the malice-corrupted Kidei, the game seems to be insinuating that the ritual was actually a good thing. Like, they don't actually come out and say all that, but when the malice tries getting out, Kidei takes her place as a human deadbolt and the music is all triumphant. Kind of like the lesson here wasn't that people shouldn't be raising daughters for the express purpose of one day gouging their eyes out and pulling them apart with rope, but instead that if you are going to do that stuff, make sure you do it right the first time. And to be honest, as a player, the most generous interpretation I can come up with is one of, well, I mean, the girl did already get brutally murdered. We may as well use her spirit to perform its intended purpose. And that really tripped me out. In a Western story, the point would probably be something like, the terrible shit that people do to keep evil away can often be much worse than the evil they're trying to banish in the first place. No, but here in Fatal Frame, it isn't saying that it's a tragedy that some young girl had to endure such punishment. Instead, it's saying the real tragedy here is that her murder didn't have the desired outcome. Now, to be fair, it is pretty common to see these themes of glorifying self-sacrifice in Japanese media, but I guess I just wasn't ready to see it in my dinky little PS2 horror game yet. Oh, and I touched on this a bit before, but the only reason Mafuyu was held here instead of being killed instantly like everybody else was because he looks exactly like the guy Kidei fell in love with before she died. You know, they don't really explain this as having any meaning outside of sheer coincidence, which makes it all the more strange when he shows up in the final cutscene and refuses to leave Kidei's side as the mansion starts to come down around them. Now, I know there is a more positive ending that can be achieved, but you're going to have to beat the game in the unlocked hard mode to see it, and the devs have confirmed the normal ending is the canon one anyways. So if we list out the events as they've taken place, Mafuyu comes to this mansion to look for his mentor, then is mistaken for a guy that was killed a very long time ago and held in that mansion by a ghost. Then he, I guess, develops a case of Stockholm Syndrome, refusing to leave her side despite the fact that, like previously mentioned, he has absolutely no connection to her outside of a passing resemblance to her ex-boyfriend. You know, I'm talking a lot of shit here, but I would say, you know, it's a horror game ending. It's not amazing, but aside from it taking a very pro-killing women for a good reason stance on things, it gets the job done as well as it needs to. Sure, I do think it suffers from a wild tonal change at the end, but in the grand scheme of things, it's certainly not the worst ending I've ever seen before. As Miku makes it out of the mansion, we get a closing summary of the game's events in Mafuyu's voice, and Miku wakes up to the place completely destroyed. All of the spirits that were trapped there start to scatter, and Miku lets us know that ever since that day, she hasn't been able to see things that other people can't see anymore. Honestly, it's a cute little note to finish out on. And speaking of which, it's about time we let everybody else back in so I can do the same thing for this section. Fatal Frame's story is a really interesting one for a few reasons. First and foremost, because it's light voice acting and heavy reading requirement. It shares a lot in common with titles like Parasite Eve and SMT Devil Summoner, in the sense that it was released in a period where most games were using voice dialogue to tell their stories, but neglects to do so in some capacity. And you know, I gotta say, I think this was actually a really solid move. Not only is the sparse voice acting that is included in the game pretty far from being good enough to properly tell the story anyways, but on top of that, there's just a certain ambiance to sitting there reading through private diaries chronicling a person's last days on Earth while an uninterrupted ghostly tune plays in the background. It's genuinely really effective, and I think having a person voice these lines would have really taken away from that. One of the other factors that made it stand out for me though was its pacing. You start the game off with a good amount of info on your motivations, and then you start discovering these really small and sometimes disjointed puzzle pieces that make up the mystery that is Himuro Mansion. You're given this satisfyingly slow drip feed of story, and when you do get story beats, sometimes it's not going to mean much to you until you get some more context, and a good portion of that context isn't dealt out until the final third of the game. And you know, I'll be honest, at first I thought this was going to be an issue for me. After all, I'm not really keen on Japanese ghost media in the first place, so if the story was going to be absent for long periods of time, I would want something else to fill that void. But you know, as I continue to play the game, I really came to appreciate how many organic aha moments this created. As a really good example, in the first chapter of the game, you find a lot of news articles on these gruesome murders that took place in the woods near Himuro Mansion and police reports on finding bodies with no limbs in the area. And it might be another 2 or 3 straight hours of gameplay before you find out these weren't just little tidbits of world building showing the place to have a malignant history, but instead direct accounts of some really important story events. And honestly, it's kind of masterful how well they pace out your meager narrative helpings. It felt like I was in a constant state of looking for answers to a question I found half an hour ago, and when the game would begrudgingly answer that, it would leave me with an even bigger one to keep me engaged until the next one dropped. And because so much of the story isn't directly spoken to the player through dialogue, it does sort of feel like you're putting this one together yourself. I know in reality the devs are just leading us by the nose via these documents, but it says a lot that I wasn't exactly aware of that while it was happening. Instead of the game saying, here's what happened in a matter-of-fact way, it'll use a second-hand account of noises being heard or bodies being found. Then a few hours later, I'll read something about a specific part of the ritual or a body being disposed of, and I'll remember that previous news article. It essentially forces you to put two and two together, but in a way that makes it feel like you're the one doing it instead of the game spoon-feeding you information. It may not be something that everyone's going to get into. I mean, there is a lot of required reading, but I always appreciate it when a story writer is nice enough to let me feel like I'm the one putting things together. It's sort of like the narrative equivalent of being forced to let a sibling play video games with you and handing them a controller that isn't really plugged in. I'm sure some of you have noticed by this point, but I am sort of stuck here without a lot of critical stuff to say about Fatal Frame's story. And it's not because it doesn't do anything wrong, because it definitely does. But as far as I see it, when it does mess up, you can still feel this intentional earnestness to it. And it gives off a very hard, here's the story that we wanted to tell, and exactly the way we wanted to tell it sort of vibe. And with that kind of noticeable attitude, it's really hard not to be won over. Which is why I give this game's story my highest rating of, it's pretty good. When I first came across Fatal Frame, it was on the shelves of a rental joint. At the time, me and my brother had been heavy into skateboarding, so you didn't exactly have to twist our arms to get us pushing pavement in the direction of our local Hollywood video.
He's up at the game. Hey.
Seeing FF's cover there on the rack, I'd never heard of it before, and I certainly had no idea that it would draw a lot of foundational inspiration from Resident Evil. I just sort of glanced at the back of the box and thought it had an interesting look to it. So we skated back home, and like you might imagine, I was really into it right from the start. At the time, survival horror games weren't exactly in vogue, so the odds of me just randomly stumbling onto a title existing in my favorite genre that I also had zero knowledge of weren't great. Although at first you could be excused for not seeing the resemblance. By default, Fatal Frame has you controlling your character with a pretty familiar modern system, which means if you hit a direction on the analog stick, your character will move in that direction regardless of their orientation on screen. But if you head to the options, you can switch to the C control style, which has you using a very unique version of tank controls. The basics are all here, meaning you can hit up on the D-pad to move your character towards whatever direction they're currently facing, and left and right rotates Miku around on her axis. There is an ironically named run button, which will have Miku transitioning from a speed I can only describe as nearly inert to a full-on run filmed in slow motion. Aside from the speed though, this run button is one of the larger innovations to the tank control system that I think I've ever seen. Like I said before, you can use the up direction to move Miku forward like usual, but about 30 minutes into the game I realized that button was sort of redundant. In this game, holding down the run button doesn't modify the up input, but instead it kind of replaces it. When you hit square or X depending on the port, Miku will start running in whatever direction she's facing, leaving you to just steer her, kind of like you're playing a racing game. It's a pretty damn interesting innovation in a control style that hasn't seen any real forward progress since the advent of the quick 180-degree turn. And on that note, the other difference is that the down direction doesn't move you backwards at all. Instead, this is how you perform a quick turn, and unlike the whole run button thing, this took me a very long time to get used to. I mean, slowly backing up to avoid damage in a survival horror game is engraved in my DNA at this point, and I don't really mind saying that this was still tripping me up at the very last boss encounter of the game. Taken as a whole though, this is a very interesting approach to survival horror controls. You might hit a tiny learning curve, but after the first, half hour or so, it starts feeling really good. This whole run button acting as a racing game-esque gas pedal thing gives the normal act of exploring these disheveled, rope-filled hallways an almost skillful feeling. Sort of like I'm executing some complex maneuver by turning just the right amount to stay straight coming out of a corner. You know, as I'm sitting here writing this out, I'm realizing these aren't exactly massive changes, but they do a lot to liven up a control style that, by the time this game was released, had become sort of old hat. To be honest, though, I'm not 100% that I made the right choice by committing to them. I imagine being able to turn in any direction I pleased at a moment's notice instead of having to wait for the turn animation to finish would have saved me from some of the more frustrating fights, but I mean, what can I say? If there's even a remote chance that there's an option for tank controls, I'd feel like a charlatan for not using them, if anything, just for all the shit that I've talked to their detractors over the years. So by all means, try both, but if the game seems a little too difficult, switch to that default control setup. Now, I'm sure you've noticed I've mentioned the term survival horror a lot so far, and besides the obvious comparisons you can all see with your eyes, I can assure you Fatal Frame follows the holy RE playbook very closely. I would hope most of you are familiar with the formula by now, but the act of making your way through Himuro Mansion is going to be governed by you either having the right key to unlock a door or the right key item. This can range anywhere from finding an obscure object and inserting it into an even more obscure device, or the more common door puzzle that'll need you to not only have the right stuff in your inventory, but will also have you looking through your collected notes for clues. And on top of that, there are these mechanical head scratchers that I for some reason had a lot of fun with. Just like any other self-respecting game in the genre, smashing the interact key on every single square inch of this place is going to result in a nice cache of hidden ammo and healing items. And while you're doing all that, you'll be crisscrossing the same rooms and hallways a nearly uncountable amount of times. After all, survival horror is a house built on a solid concrete foundation of backtracking. Which means even at the most efficient level of play, you'll come across a door or a puzzle that requires an item, then backtrack through the mansion until you find that item, then backtrack back to the door in order to unlock a single room which will almost surely contain another door that'll force you to do it all over again. And listen, even I can recognize that does not sound fun at all, but you gotta believe me, there's something wildly relaxing about working your way through a game location so many times you've become subconsciously more familiar with its layout than that of your own house. It's sort of like grinding in an RPG. You could do it for 4 hours straight, never making any actual progress in the game, and still walk away feeling like you've accomplished something. I don't know, maybe it's an acquired taste, but I'm pretty sure every game genre has its version of this effect. Unlike any RE title, Fatal Frame is broken up into an intro and 4 main chapters or nights, and this plays into the whole survival horror thing really well in my opinion. As you progress into the next chapter, you'll oftentimes wake up in a different part of the mansion than you passed out in, and any extra items all get reset. So if you're running low on resources, you can count on a bit of a scheduled refill, but more specific to the exploration, door locks and passageways can become blocked or might require totally new keys to get through as the chapters change. Objects you couldn't interact with before might hold clues needed to move forward, and of course ghosts will repopulate the place. At first I wasn't really sure how to feel about this, but when I opened my map to see that all my progress had been reset, I don't know, I was kind of excited. By the time this happens, you will have already unlocked a large portion of the mansion, and shaking that progress up a bit does tons for extending the gameplay without the setting getting too boring. On each night, you'll be able to access more new areas too, so sort of like I'd do in a Metroidvania game when I encountered a new item, on each chapter change I would rush off to areas that looked significant but couldn't be examined or interacted with in the previous one. Doors that used to be nailed shut might now be open, and there were a few instances where a major intersection I was used to taking would get cut off, forcing me to find all new routes. And I know this sounds like a cheap way to squeeze more gameplay out of a single location, which, to be fair, it is, but I also think it plays really well into this genre. I will be honest and let you know that in any other game I would have been pissed about progress essentially getting taken away from me at set points, but here it was actually really fun. This being a ghost hunting game, you couldn't exactly put a Beretta in Miku's hand, so to stand in for firearms, we have Fatal Frame's Camera Obscura, an ancient magic device that can damage spirits by taking pictures of them. Which is genuinely a smart move. I mean, across the world, tons of cultures already have folk tales and superstitions that tie ghosts to cameras. So as the game introduces the concept, it goes down a little easier than most sci-fi game mechanics might. Speaking of which, aiming the camera with the circle or B button will take you into a first-person mode where you have to keep the ghost centered on screen for a certain amount of time to charge up a more powerful shot. While in the aiming mode, you can move your body with the right analog stick, which technically means if you chose the tank controls option, you actually didn't screw yourself out of the ability to walk backwards, you just can only do it while you're aiming. And you know, this might just be my dumb head, but I absolutely could not get used to the idea of the D-pad or the left analog stick moving my view while the right one controlled my movement. It just feels like gaming sacrilege, and as you can tell from this footage, I really never got used to it. Getting back to that whole critical thing though, I really like the idea of trading general safety for the reward of a stronger hit, and after about an hour or so, that fully charged noise started to sound like music to my ears. Catching a ghost just before they hit you or when they're charging an attack of their own will net you even more damage on top of that critical, which is something that literally never fails to feel really great when you're able to nail it. Just like a gun with ammo, there are 4 types of film that the camera obscura can use, with each one increasing significantly in damage and rarity. But more interesting than that is the fact that your camera's usefulness goes far beyond just self-defense. During your time in the mansion, you'll come across scripted moments where, if you're fast enough, you can catch a ghost on camera doing something creepy. Sometimes these can be pretty trivial to capture, but other times you'll be left scratching your head how anyone could have possibly gotten that shot without already knowing what's going to happen before it does. And if you do end up missing a lot of these, which you probably will, I wouldn't worry too much. I'm still not 100% what they really do. I mean, I assume they affect your endgame grade, but I'm not exactly basing that on any facts, so maybe don't spend too much time obsessing over a 100% rating. Going even further than that, you can also use Miku's old-timey camera to assist in exploration, as some doors will be locked by a talisman that'll require you to go and snap a pic of a certain place in the mansion, which is where that environmental familiarity I was talking about before comes in real handy. You're only given a small idea of where it might be, so it really pays to keep your eyes open as you run around because you never know when you're going to need to use some landmarks to guide you to the right spot. Once you snap a pic of the designated location, the adjoining talisman will burn off, which might be the most inefficient locking system I've ever heard of, but I really love that they decided to include the game's one and only weapon in all of the item hunting and puzzle solving as well. There's also scattered locations where you can get a picture of some kind of invisible, lingering spirit, but once again, I don't know what these do, so don't worry if you can't find them all. Getting back to where Fatal Frame sort of innovates on the survival horror genre, they have this cool little system that helps cut down on frustration. Anytime you're near an item, non-threatening ghost, or anything else that could be picked up, the little jewel on the bottom right of your screen will glow blue, and when a ghost is near, it'll glow orange. And believe me, that latter detail is a godsend, since these ghosts can move through walls and your shots, well, they can't. So it's nice to have at least a tiny barometer that'll let you know if you're aiming in the right direction. And you know, at first, I'll admit this seemed a little too handholdy. I mean, I'm a real red-blooded American badass. I've found all the hidden ammo in RE2, so I don't need the thief visibility crystal letting me know when I'm playing a survival horror game correctly. But I will admit that I grew to appreciate it for a reason we'll definitely have to talk about a little bit later. Replacing the classic Resident Evil door transitions, we have Miku just sort of deciding that being chased by incorporeal threats isn't dangerous enough to risk opening a door too fast. And believe me, I can take long door transitions. If anything, they can add to a game's atmosphere and pacing, but the doors in this game open so slowly that by the time you get control of your character again, you can run right into them as they swing. And Jesus, don't get me started on the ladder climbing. Yeah, you having fun yet? Imagine this happening on accident because you got too close to a ladder when running away from a ghost. More than once. But outside of that, if you're an old RE head like me, this is all great news. I mean, backtracking, tank controls, puzzles, key hunting, all the boys are here and it's great. But sadly, there's a lot of other stuff in Fatal Frame that leads me to believe this was someone's first crack at survival horror. And the very first thing that's likely to get on your nerves not even 10 steps from the front entrance is just how easy it is to get Miku caught up on random bits of environmental geometry. I can't really describe it in any other way but say that it feels like anything with boundaries applied to it is just kind of sticky. In games like this, it's not uncommon to hug a wall while you run, but in Fatal Frame, this slows you down to a wild degree and sometimes even stops you in your tracks. And further compounding that issue, when you're using the tank controls mode, not being able to back up and essentially being forced into a constant state of running forward means it's very hard to free yourself from what seems to be the air directly adjacent to a door frame. So you either have to stop running to give yourself a little adjustment, or you do this move where you keep barreling forward, rotating left and right over and over again until you're free. This happens an absolutely staggering amount over the course of a normal playthrough, and believe me, we will talk about how it affects the game's combat in a bit, but more to the point, this being a survival horror title, you'll be running around exploring far more than you'll be snapping pics of ghosts. And when 75% of the experience is driven by navigating narrow hallways and rough, dilapidated terrain, maybe don't also make me come to a dead stop whenever a molecule of Miku's shoe just barely brushes past a particularly menacing piece of baseboard. And if you're wondering, the previously mentioned slow run speed does not help with this problem in the least. On the less destructive side of things, it can be a little tough lining yourself up with items and hitting the examine button. It might look like you're right on target, but nothing happens until you've made a few micro adjustments in that spot, and then all of a sudden the game figures out what you're trying to do. To be honest, I can't really tell if this is a visual thing or a programming thing. On one hand, it could be the perspective messing with my eyes and making me think I'm over an item when I'm not. But since this also happens with stuff that's on shelves and in dressers, I'd imagine they just made the items, hitbox a little too small, which sadly requires precision that the game doesn't exactly have. Alright, so next up is one of my largest issues with the game, and I'm not going to beat around the bush. Right up front, I'll let you guys know that Fatal Frame has some of the most unnecessarily frustrating combat I have seen in a very, very long time. Which really sucks, because truly, it's an idea that works really well on paper. I've already explained the basics to a degree, but once again, the name of the game here is keeping a ghost centered long enough to build up the power of your next attack. You can swap out different films, which for some reason cause more damage to ghosts, and if you manage to snap a shot just before an attack, when your aiming reticle glows red, you'll get a 0 shot. This is basically the game's version of a critical hit, but even more important because it nets you exponentially more points that you can use on upgrading your camera stats or unlocking special attacks. And you know, for the first hour or so, this system is probably going to work really well for you. On the challenge side of things, the ghosts have a tendency to go invisible, their movements are erratic, and they can float through walls or solid surfaces, so keeping one of them in your sights long enough to do some real damage can actually require some skill. In these starting moments, despite the combat feeling really snappy and responsive, ghosts are still a pretty big threat, with most of them taking away more than a quarter of your life per hit. Which is a nice skill versus risk versus reward scenario. It really sets up a kick-ass alternative to survival horror combat, but it's not long until you hit a nearly vertical difficulty curve. After you're done with the first, say, quarter of the game, the ghosts become insanely fast. They teleport around and start taking away more than 50% of your life per hit. On top of that, the faster enemies shine a light on something that might not have been so noticeable before. It kind of feels like this game hasn't really nailed down a concrete idea of what does and doesn't count as a hit. Sometimes you'll have a ghost right in your sights and snap a pic only for that ghost to arbitrarily decide that, well, actually you didn't. Now, to be fair, sometimes this would be because they suddenly passed in front of something solid, and that's understandable. But going through some of the footage in my video editing software, I found out the game was genuinely pulling some bullshit. And while I'm saying all this, I want you to keep an open mind because at first, this is going to sound like some real scrub logic, but I promise you I have proof. Now, like I mentioned before, I took some of my combat footage into my editing software and watched it back frame by frame. And while doing that, I noticed something interesting. In a not entirely insignificant portion of the encounters where I would miss a 0 shot, just as I would notice my reticle turning red, I'd hit the flash button precisely 1 to 3 frames too late. If I go frame by frame in this clip, you can see that I have a red circle indicating a 0 shot. So I try to get one off, but just 2 frames later, it switches to blue, which means it's just a normal shot. I can find you a wild number of exactly similar scenarios here. I am almost always precisely 1 to 3 frames off when I miss a 0 shot. And to add insult to injury, in almost every single one of these encounters, just as soon as my still frame picture clears the screen, before the enemies even had a chance to move, suddenly I see that reticle is blood red again. So to put this all into perspective, I had a 0 shot. I went to hit the button, but when I hit that button, I just so happened to land in a 1 to 3 frame window that wasn't a 0 shot, and on the frame coming back from hitting the shutter button, it is once again a 0 shot. This is gonna sound wild, but I truly think the game is reading inputs and randomly canceling out 0 shots as soon as you hit the shutter button. And like I said, I was able to find a ridiculous amount of these exact scenarios across the game, and while that may sound like a me problem, this was happening with wild consistency. It would be one thing if my reaction time varied across a few frames, but I was consistently hitting the flash button 1 to 3 frames late. A feat that feels almost impossible given it's happening across different ghosts with different movement patterns and varying wind-up lengths for their 0 attacks. Some of them will have a 0 attack be available for a long period of time, and some of them for a very short window. And across all of that variance, I was somehow able to keep hitting the exact same frame target. And just to put all of this into further context, 1 frame out of 60 FPS is just 16 milliseconds. I promise you I could not be this consistent if I tried. In order to combat this, I essentially stopped even attempting 0 shots on most ghosts past the 3rd night. I would still get some in as a fluke or if I was in a perfect situation, but for the most part, I had to actively stay away from using this mechanic because it would so often negate any damage I could have done even with a regular shot. And believe me, that is frustrating as hell, but what makes it way worse is how fast and cheap these spirits become. Once you get past the 3rd or 4th night, in any room that isn't a big wide open floor plan, these guys will duck behind walls, phase through furniture, or just flat out disappear right in front of you at crazy speeds. And as you might expect, you can't land an attack on them unless they're visible to you. To deal with this, your jewel will alert you with its varying levels of brightness, whether or not you're facing a ghost's general direction, but it can be really finicky and it doesn't account for verticality. I found a good strategy is to track ghosts with the camera, getting off whatever hits you can, then returning to the 3rd person perspective to get a better look at your surroundings once you've lost sight of them, which can make combat with certain ghosts incredibly tedious. You'll just take a picture and then spin around in place for what seems like forever, only to get one more shot and then have to repeat that 6, maybe 7 times. But aside from that, the ones that can teleport will almost 100% of the time just teleport themselves directly in front of you. So if you're standing still, you get to eat a cheap hit, and if you're running, you get to feel like an idiot because you ran into a cheap hit. And it doesn't really matter where you go. The game just sort of spawns them right on top of you regardless of the direction you're facing. And the blind woman ghosts, I have to say, they deserve a special mention here. Mostly because they're just a walking combination of every single enemy's most annoying quirks combined into one. Which might not be obvious right off the bat, especially because I find them to be the most visually cool looking enemies out of the bunch. These things tend to walk around pretty slowly, and they can charge an attack that has them flying towards you no matter how far you are away from them, which, to be fair, is easy enough to counter. Either you get a 0 shot off as she charges, or just switch to 3rd person and move slightly to the left or right, letting her fly by. Now, everything I just said is how all of this would work in a perfect world. As it is, these ghosts have a wild tendency to teleport themselves behind a wall, charge the flying grab attack where you can't interrupt it or see it, and then just zoom over to your location where you will most likely be frantically turning your camera to echolocate where the hell they went. And the very best part of all of this is 50% of the time, they just stay invisible while this attack is active. So not only have they hidden themselves to a point where you can't predict which direction they're coming from, but even if you could, you'd have no idea how close they are to shaving off more than half of your health with that attack. At one point, I found a journal entry talking about how these ghosts operate completely off of sound, which had me thinking, well, I was just an idiot. Maybe the reason these encounters felt so unfair to me was because I've been fighting them wrong the whole time. So the next time I came across one, I tried keeping my finger off the run button, but it would still reliably teleport right to my exact location for every single one of its attacks. Well, then I figured maybe walking makes noise too, so I would stay in one spot for the next fight and she would still teleport right to me every time she wanted to attack. This game has bosses and tons of really hard enemy encounters, but this blind woman specifically, she traumatized me. They do this thing when they grab you where they scream "my eyes," and eventually just the sound of this would send me into a fit of rage even if I was doing well in the fight. And you know I'm being really specific here, but I just gotta get general with you guys. The combat in this game, it nearly broke me. When I start one of these full series retrospectives, I of course want to finish every game that I talk about. It'd be really weird if I didn't, but I gotta be honest, I genuinely considered stopping this one about 75% of the way through. I just did not want to beat it. Guys, genuinely, it was so goddamn frustrating playing this game at some points. I did eventually push through to the final credit sequence, but to get there, I had to save before and after every single ghost encounter, boss or not. And in order to progress, I not only had to beat each one of these fights, but with enough resources left over afterwards to make the rest of the game finishable. While they do a really good job in the early chapters of loading you up on healing items, as the game progresses, it feels like you not only come across far less of these, but you end up using them at a far accelerated rate. For reference, when I first started capturing footage, it was with the PS2 original, and I made it to the last chapter, but I was so lacking in resources that the only way to continue forward would be to perfectly complete each and every enemy encounter in the most efficient and damage-free way, which I was nowhere near interested in attempting. So instead of doing that, I started the game up again on the Xbox port and ironically ran into nearly the exact same issue. Even when I had intimate knowledge of which fights would take place where, after I'd already fought most of the game's bad guys and formulated some kind of strategy for them, I almost found myself in the exact same scenario as before when I was doing really poorly. And you know, honestly, I hate being negative like this because the game's exploration, atmosphere, and hell, even the theoretical idea of its combat, they all work really well. And all that hits way harder because, like I said before, for the first few hours of the game, it's kind of incredible. Even when the more cheap and frustrating side of it started showing up, I was still able to focus on all the stuff it was doing right. It's an honest-to-goodness tragedy. Here we have a really capable survival horror title that takes a very interesting, wholly unique crack at the genre, and a majority of it is really well made. But all of that eventually coalesces into sheer frustration. This is gonna sound so stupid, but I didn't even beat this game because I wanted to. At a certain point, I just didn't want it to think that it had defeated me. I really want to recommend that people check this one out. If anything, just because you can't really find this specific type of survival horror outside of this franchise. But with how much rage it filled me with after its halfway point, I'd say the best thing I could recommend is that all of you at least start the game. Play it, get a feel for how it works, and then don't be afraid to drop it the second it starts getting on your nerves, because trust me, by that point, you're going to be staring down a good 3, maybe 4 hours of pure misery. But outside of the absolutely unfair combat, I'd say this is a perfect 8.5, 9 out of 10, at least in terms of survival horror games. The exploration is killer, Himuro Mansion has a nice diversity of locations to it, and the item hunting you're going to have to do to get through it is very satisfying. It's actually kind of sad how good the rest of Fatal Frame's gameplay elements are, because I just find myself wishing we didn't have this massive dark cloud in the form of cheap, annoying combat hanging over the latter half of it. Like I said before, this is still a game I'd recommend you guys check out, but my advice would be to only play it until it starts to frustrate you. Unlike most video games, you won't be pushing through the annoyance so you can get to the more satisfying parts, because once you hit a certain point in Fatal Frame, you're just struggling to give yourself the opportunity to struggle again later. Now, if you don't feel like putting yourself through that, or you don't like the idea of starting up a game that you don't plan on finishing, I totally understand that, but if you've already played most of the Resident Evil style games out there, you sorta have to play this one. In summary, I have no idea how I feel about Fatal Frame's gameplay. I hope you guys have been able to form your own conclusions based on all this blabbering, because as a guy who wrote it all out, I have not. Alright, so on to an infinitely more positive subject. Fatal Frame is a really good looking video game. Beginning its life as an early PS2 release, I was expecting for it to have aged kind of poorly, but I still came away impressed. A A lot of these earlier titles on the console tend to have this soft, almost fuzzy look to them, almost like all the straight lines and corners were traded out for rounded edges, and normally I would say that this negatively affects the type of game that's going for that photorealistic aesthetic. But since Fatal Frame has firmly planted its flag in the land of anime, I think it actually works really well. Which is genuinely ironic because when it crossed the pond into the States, Tecmo decided to dial some of that anime flavor back. They changed Miku's hair color, shrunk her lips a bit, slimmed down her face, and took away some of the bulbousness from her eyes. And to be honest, I'm not 100% if this is because I played the US release first, but I kind of feel like these were changes for the best. Outside of a Japanese versus Western art perspective, new Miku, at least to me, looks a little more visually and aesthetically attractive, but I don't know, feel free to let me know which one you like better in the comments. And if you're interested in a much more in-depth look at these two versions, I found this really great comparison video by YouTuber Kelpelt. The guy knows his way around port comparisons, and he seems to understand obtuse video jargon as well, which definitely gives him street cred in my book. Getting back on track though, if you've seen my coverage of Silent Hill 2, you're gonna know that the PS2's unique, proprietary architecture could be very limiting. But if a developer knew what they were doing, they could squeeze performance and effects out of the console that flat out couldn't be replicated by the competition. My best example is always going to be Silent Hill 2's transparent fog, and how it needed to be significantly nerfed on the much more powerful Xbox in order for that port to run at a halfway decent frame rate. You can expect to see a lot of those PS2 only, fill rate dependent kind of tricks here. For example, the entire game seems to run with that faux per pixel motion blur that the PS2 was famous for, and the often less used bloom lighting effects that they applied to some light sources and reflections. The ghosts themselves are definitely taking advantage of the PS2's affinity for great looking transparencies, and you can expect an absolute smattering of different post-processing effects to be applied to the screen when they're around as well. Which normally would be a good thing. I mean, this is technically impressive, but when all of these screen effects start to overlap with each other, it can be kind of visually fatiguing. And it doesn't necessarily help that the game makes use of my old nemesis, the PS2 era full screen static filter. On top of that, if you're paying attention during some cutscenes or whipping out your camera to get really close to stuff, you might notice some very low res textures, but to be honest, you sort of have to go out of your way to look at them. So don't take that as a complaint, but more of a, hey, look what I found. To get this footage, I used the RetroTink 4K to upscale and deinterlace Fatal Frame's 480i image. But even with that kind of horsepower, at the game's 60 field per second output, you're still going to notice combing artifacts when things start moving really fast. Now of course, if you have a PS2 that's capable of launching Homebrew, then you can force this game into progressive scan with GSC, but I didn't really mess with that this time around, and that's because there already is a 480p version of the game. It's just on a different console. The Xbox version of Fatal Frame was labeled the Special Edition and hit US shores just a few months after the PS2 original did. This release of the game would feature all new ghosts to fight, an overhauled heads-up display for the camera, new costumes, and a harder difficulty mode unlocked after beating the game. Which of course is great to have, but more important to me, it natively outputs 480p. Looking at the two side by side, it's pretty noticeable the detail and sharpness gained when jumping from interlace to progressive scan output, but it's definitely not what I would call a massive divide, at least not at first glance. Thanks to its interlaced output, the PS2 port tends to get very muddy when Miku or the camera are in heavy motion, and you're going to see the aforementioned combing artifacts because of its fast 60 field per second operation. Which, to be honest, is a quirk that you're going to learn to live with if you're upscaling PS2 games, but when you do have an opportunity to see one running without interlacing, you should always take advantage of it. Like I already mentioned, it wasn't exactly uncommon back in the day for PS2 games to lose a lot of their graphical flair when jumping over to the Xbox. This wasn't always the case, but for the most part, if a title was developed on the PS2 first and used some of that console's little hardware tricks, it was probably going to have to slim down a bit before Microsoft's much better spec'd machine could run it well. And at least to my eye, this does seem to be the case with Fatal Frame. I noticed a few of the post-processing effects either weren't present or would mess up from time to time, but to be honest, I was more interested in the game's frame rate. Fatal Frame's original release on the PS2 operated at 60 interlaced fields per second, like a lot of early titles developed for the console, which, as far as the human eye is concerned, by the way, is effectively 60 frames per second. Because it's a lot easier than the alternative, a lot of Xbox ports of the day would chop this down to its progressive scan counterpart, which is 30 frames per second. Which, if you'll remember, is what happened when Silent Hill 2 crossed over to the green team. But with Fatal Frame, I'm happy to say they kept the smooth frame rate. Now, this is just an assumption on my part, but since the original PS2 version did use a full screen motion blur for basically its entire runtime, I would assume this gave the team porting the game an open license to use frame interpolation and let its slight blur effect take the place of the PS2 specific graphical trick. And if some of that terminology has you a little stumped, don't worry. That just means that during the porting process, each two interlaced fields were being smashed together to make a progressive scan frame. But as you math experts may have already figured out, this would have the effective frame rate. I think in order to keep that smooth 60 FPS look, they used interpolation, which is the process of introducing composite frames in between each real original one. Essentially, every other frame that you'll see in the video game is a combination of the frame that came before it and the one that's going to immediately follow it. Now, normally you wouldn't use this because it has a smeary sort of effect on fast-moving graphics, but in a game that was already blurry in motion by design, this side effect will be completely hidden. Now, this next one is something I didn't even notice about the PS2 original until I started playing this Xbox port, but that first release of the game was wacky dark. I've been boosting the brightness of my PS2 footage in post so the video stays watchable, but here's the raw image without me helping it along, and here's what it looks like on Xbox. And, you know, sure, you could probably argue there are a few scenarios where the PS2 version looks a little more slick thanks to its inky black levels. But I would say in an interactive medium, I would much rather spend hours looking at and engaging with the easier to see Xbox version. And sticking with the upsides, I found the redesigned heads-up display in the camera mode on this port to be much better looking than the original. In a strict gameplay sense, I was able to notice an improved run speed on Xbox, and that even crossed over into the first-person camera mode. In that original PS2 release, moving your camera is actually pretty slow, so much so that they let you hold the run button while moving it for faster panning. Well, here in the Xbox port, the default camera panning speed is so snappy that I found holding the run button made it a little too fast to accurately control. And believe me, I was able to notice that things were moving kind of slow on the PS2, but you really have no idea until you move from this port to the original. It also seems like ghosts here on Xbox are giving out way better payouts for kills and zero shots because I maxed out my camera stats much earlier than I did on PS2. To be totally honest, if you're looking to play Fatal Frame right now, I would say the Xbox port is the one to reach for, but that being said, there are some downsides you guys should be aware of. The first and really least offensive being that over here on Xbox, along with the brighter picture, comes more washed out, less saturated colors on top of some really noticeable color banding, which is a term that refers to these visible stripes that show up when colors don't have enough of a gradient to smoothly transition from one to the other. Now personally, I don't think the colors being muted really affects things all that much, and the banding was more of an interesting quirk, but I had to mention it. Now getting back to the subject of Xbox ports not exactly handling PS2 effects very well, you will notice a few instances, mostly in combat, of the frame rate dipping by at least half. Now to be fair, most of the game does run at a smooth 60, but when certain ghosts show up, you can expect big spikes in frame time and even bigger drops in frame rate. With an FPS deficit like that, things did feel like they were running in slow motion, but if I'm being honest, I came to welcome the slowdown because of how well it allowed me to deal with enemy attacks. As things would start to slow down, I would know an attack was incoming, and because it's moving at half the speed, I get roughly double the amount of time to react to it. Listen, I already told you how hard the game is. I'll take whatever leg up it'll give me. As you guys can see, these are not the kind of flaws that should be keeping any person away from this port, especially when you consider how much it helps having that tweaked difficulty and faster run speed. Cards on the table, if you're going to play Fatal Frame right now, I can't in good conscience recommend it be the PS2 original. The Xbox version just made way too many micro improvements to things that really add up to a noticeable difference. To be fair, the elements that made the original so infuriating can still be found here in a lot of ways, but they've also given you much better tools to deal with them. I mean, really, getting grabbed by a cheap attack that you couldn't have seen coming is gonna suck no matter which port you go with. But take it from me, having a run speed that would technically allow you to dodge that attack if you did indeed see it coming, it helps. Don't get me wrong, it's still an absolute bastard of a game, but this is the version I was finally able to beat, so I'd say the gains far outweigh the losses. It looks like both versions cost about the same on the used market, so if you get the chance, I'd say your money would be better spent on the one that doesn't hate your guts quite so much. Well, this has been a pretty up and down ride. I both love and hate this game, and I imagine this video has felt schizophrenic at times because of that. So what do you say we take all of this and hammer it down into something that approximates a take? The first entry in the Fatal Frame series is a title I think everyone familiar with this genre should try at least once. It takes really common themes and mechanics from games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill, but offers up its own twist on them. A twist informed by a very Japanese mentality behind its creation. But everything I said in the gameplay portion of the video still stands. This is a wildly frustrating playthrough, and it defeated me completely on the PS2. I'm more than aware that my taste can be a little unique, and there are people out there who actually appreciate a more uphill fight in terms of difficulty, but I've got to assume most people watching this right now are not going to want such an unfair and hard to predict challenge. Which is why I think this should probably be a game that you casually pull down every once in a while, get to a part that beats your ass, and then put it back away again. Don't get me wrong, the atmosphere, mood, story, and visuals are all top-notch and well worth taking in, but everyone's gonna get to a point where they feel like it's being too cheap. Hell, without save scumming, I would have never made it through the game, and I imagine my 5.5 hour clear time looks something more like 7 when you add up all the time I spent retrying fights. And you know, despite me saying all this negative stuff that I really do believe, I'm still torn here. I mean, on one end, this title takes survival horror and twists it into something that's both really fresh and 100% familiar. It does the genre well, and for a smaller game, it feels really tight. But when it comes to the combat, things are just flat out a mess. The first few ghosts you come across might have lowered your guard a bit, but it doesn't take long for the game to start throwing absolutely baffling amounts of bullshit at you. Like I said before, each person is going to reach their own limit at some point, and my advice is not to push past that. Once you've made it to the halfway point, you've already seen 95% of what the game has in store anyways. And to be honest, life is way too short to be restarting ghost encounters over and over again just so an old PS2 horror title doesn't feel like it's walking away with your masculinity in its hands. I mean, that's what I did, and I can assure you, it was not a valuable use of my time. And speaking of my time, I think it's about up on this one. I know this isn't exactly the sharpest note to end on for a first entry in a full series retrospective, but I'm still really excited to see where things go from here. I mean, realistically, they can't get any worse, right? Well, anyways, I am stoked you guys decided to stick around for this one. Here's hoping I get to see all of you next time, but until then, thank you very much for watching The Fatal Frame. Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for hanging out with me for a bit today. If you're looking to support this channel, aka allow me to continue doing full series retrospectives, I've got a link to my Patreon and one for YouTube members down in the description. This is gonna sound like some trite bullshit, but I really can't tell you how much your guys' support means, and beyond that, it lets me keep working on the content that I want to make as opposed to the kind the algorithm is rewarding at any one random moment. Being able to make a living off of my passions is an absolutely incredible experience, but I would not be able to do it without the support of the incredible people who have decided my little YouTube videos are worth their hard-earned money. So a massive thanks to those already holding me up and to anyone even considering it. I love you all and I wouldn't be here without you. Stay cool guys, and I'll see you later.